Hello and welcome back to part 6 of my Formula 1 season review. Got a bit confused with the parts at the end of the last episode. In this episode, we're going to be looking at Aston Martin. We've already looked at the likes of Alpine, Williams, AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo and Haas. If you want to check those videos out before you get onto this one, they'll be in the playlist that will be linked in the description and the playlist that this video is attached to. There's a lot to talk about with Aston Martin. They were the hopes and dreams early on in the season, but as the season went on, they dropped off. Fernando Alonso showed himself to be in excellent form at 42 years old as the season progressed, although there was a few dark spells for him as well. Lance Stroll never really seemed to find his feet this season, although there were a few impressive qualifying performances and a few impressive races. He never really kept the consistency. He was often behind Fernando Alonso, and it wasn't until the last few races where he seemed to find his feet in this car. Aston Martin came into this season with a lot of change. It's just come to my attention, 63% of you are not subscribed. What are you doing? Click that red button right now. Mike Crack joined the team as team principal, and they also hired a range of engineers from Red Bull. This all contributed to an impressive start to the season. Aston Martin were by far the second quickest team for around the first 8 to 9 races. After that period, they were in a period of limbo. They bought a few upgrades to the car that didn't really work. This meant that they fell down the order. At times they were 5th, 6th, sometimes 7th fastest on the grid during race day. This obviously wasn't what Aston Martin or Fernando Alonso were expecting after the brilliant start they had this season. So now let's get into it. Aston Martin obviously finished P5 in the Constructors' Championships. They finished behind McLaren and ahead of Alpine. Fernando Alonso will be happy to get one over on his former team, a team who couldn't make a decision on a contract extension, and they weren't sure about Oscar Piastri, and then they ended up losing both of them heading into this season. Aston Martin scored a total number of 8 podiums this season. All of them came for Fernando Alonso. Aston Martin also scored 14 top 5s this season. Fernando Alonso collected 11, Lance Stroll collected 3. On Aston Martin's way to finishing 5th in the Constructors' Championship, they collected 31 points finishes. Of these 31 points finishes, obviously Fernando Alonso was the lead with 19. Aston Martin collected a total of 280 points. That is 160 points more than their next closest team, Alpine. However, they finished only 22 points behind McLaren. Aston Martin will be ruining the DNFs that they had. They had 5 this season, 1 more than McLaren. This is obviously a keen thing to note as you look at Aston Martin, because that could be the difference between 5th and 4th. They also collected 1 flying lap point within the season. Between the 2 Aston Martin drivers of Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll, they had an average finish position of 8.91. They had an average qualifying position of 9.73. If Lance Stroll wasn't their second driver, then I personally believe that that number would be a lot higher. I also don't think they would have finished P5 this year. Now, let's take a look at each driver's season individually. Fernando Alonso started the season really brightly, and over the season he collected 8 podiums. After the Spanish GP, Fernando Alonso claimed that you wouldn't see an Aston Martin off the podium again, but he didn't get another podium until Brazil. Fernando Alonso accumulated 11 top 5 finishes and 19 points finishes over the season, and that led him to 4th in the Drivers' Championships. He finished level on points with Charles Leclerc, but he finished ahead of Charles Leclerc on countback. Fernando Alonso had 2 DNFs this season, but collected 1 flying lap point. As we can all imagine, Fernando Alonso is a man of consistency. He's a very impressive racer. He's very good at qualifying, very good in the race. He had an average finish position of 6.64 this season. Very impressive in comparison to his teammate. He had an average qualifying position of P7, which, considering the car's highs and lows this season, is very impressive. Lance Stroll collected a total of 3 top 5 finishes and 12 points finishes for the total season. He found himself in P10 in the Drivers' Championships with 74 points. Lance Stroll collected 3 DNFs and even missed the Singapore GP due to a big crash which he had in qualifying. I'm also keen to mention that with Lance Stroll, he came into the season off the back of an operation on his wrist after breaking his wrists. Although this isn't an excuse for bad performances, Lance Stroll started the season quite strongly. He was obviously not on course with his teammate because he was still recovering from that injury. An injury Daniel Ricciardo from AlphaTauri can relate to. Lance Stroll had an average race finish of 11.18 and an average qualifying position of 12.45. I'm keen to talk about Aston Martin because a lot of things are going to change in the coming years. Fernando Alonso is 42, and although they are in talks to extend his contract, they need to have an idea of who they want to replace him when he chooses to retire. He could keep going for 3-4 more years if he's fast enough, but we never know when that drop-off is going to be. 42 years old, it's time that Aston Martin start thinking to the future. The drivers that they have, like Felipe Drugovich, the Formula 2 champion from 2022, he'll be hoping for a seat at some point, and being at Aston Martin, he'd think that could come soon, especially with Alonso's age. You also have to look at the owner, Lawrence Stroll, and the fact that his son is driving the second car. Lance, although being a good driver, I do not think is good enough to provide a championship winning material, a championship. I think it could be a good driver in a midfield team like Aston Martin used to be when they were Racing Point. However, I do not think that he is good enough to compete at the top end. And that is what Aston Martin want at the end of the day. I'm keen to talk about Aston Martin's development programme. During this season, they brought a range of upgrades. Some worked to begin with, but then as they bought bigger upgrade packages, the car seemed to go backwards. Mercedes, a team who know all about this and their car not working the way they want it to. Aston Martin obviously weren't expecting the upgrades not to work properly. It got to a point where at the Austin GP, Fernando Alonso ran one spec and Lance Stroll ran the other. Coming into the next races, they both ran split cars. This meant that they weren't quite sure which upgrade parts were working and which ones wasn't, and it led to the final few races being testing for those parts to figure out which worked and which didn't. Heading into the 2024 season, I'm keen for Aston Martin to try and retain their good performance from earlier in the year. Someone like Fernando Alonso won't be happy if they fall backwards, and I could only imagine the scenes if Alpine were able to become better than Aston Martin over the winter. I'm keen for Aston Martin to find their performance again because I think we need a competitive grid next year. Aston Martin with Fernando Alonso could provide some entertaining battles at the front of the grid. You'd also have the other teams trying to impact that too, but Aston Martin are the focus for today. A discussion around the 2023 season. If you was to get rid of Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez in the Red Bull team, Fernando Alonso would have finished second in the championship behind Lewis Hamilton, having a legendary battle go all the way down to Abu Dhabi. Obviously, this isn't what happened and talking about it is irrelevant, but I think it just shows that Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton, the oldest drivers on the grid, still have it. 2024 is going to be an interesting season. If Aston Martin can retain their performance, then I'm sure there's going to be lots of competitive battles at the front. So I'm going to end this video here while talking about Aston Martin at the front, and we're then going to look into McLaren. The rise of McLaren was impressive, and I'm sure that you'll be keen to hear my opinion. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next part tomorrow. Make sure to go and find me on TikTok, pictured here, and Twitter, pictured here. These are the places where I'll keep you all up to date with all my upcoming videos and my thoughts and feelings around the Formula 1 and football weekend.